Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to this special edition of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan. In this series, Ralph and constitutional scholar Bruce Fein will lay out articles in the impeachment of President Donald J. Trump. Count 12, violation of the Due Process Clause.
Let's go to the Due Process Clause. This sounds rather vague, but I think there are more than a few listeners who know that that's one of the greatest achievements of Western civilization. The due process of law. You cannot be prosecuted, criminally accused, without having certain procedures where you can defend yourself, confront your accusers, open court, in front of a jury, etc. So basically, why did the framers put the Fifth Amendment in the Constitution, and how did Donald Trump violate it?
Well, unfortunately, not just Mr. Trump. They put in the Fifth Amendment. It basically takes a page out of the Magna Carta of 1215 and says that you can't be deprived of your liberty or property or life without due process of law. Due process of law acquired over long centuries. The obligation of the government to give you notice of what you've allegedly done that's wrongful, an opportunity to respond, a right to have counsel, to call witnesses in your defense, to confront your accusers, to have your judge or jury to be impartial. All those things essential to achieving justice. And it really is an acknowledgement that you're saying that, we can be wrong. Every event has many different dimensions to it. We want to avoid being complicit in injustice, even if it means somebody who may occasionally go free, even if they're guilty. Because it's worse for the government to be complicit in wrongdoing than a private party, because the government is so much more powerful. And we basically have abandoned due process on an industrial scale, after 9/11. With regard to Guantanamo Bay detainees, people are held there for life. They've never been charged with any crime whatsoever. We just think you may be a radical Islamist, an enemy combatant, very vaguely defined. But what takes this to a new scale, Ralph, is the idea that based upon secret information, the American people don't know, secret standards, the president can kill anybody he wants, predator drones or otherwise, without ever being accountable. He doesn't have to explain his decision to the courts, to the American people, to Congress. Everything's classified. Mr. Alaki's teenage son gets vaporized in Yemen. No accountability. And the American people still don't even know the standards the president uses. He basically plays prosecutor, judge, jury, and executioner. He combines all these different functions in himself. The definition of tyranny, according to James Madison, where's the accountability? We have no idea as we speak how many have vanished because of the exercise of this limitless, frightening executive authority.
Which, by the way, shoves aside the other two branches of government, the judiciary and legislative branches.
Yeah, they don't know. Right now, Congress, even in executive session, the American people, we have no idea what the standards President Trump or Obama or George W. Bush used to go ahead and kill people on their own based upon this secret information. How can we approve or disapprove of a standard that we're ignorant about? A standard that's a standard of life or death. The most lethal power the government can exercise. And we're clueless about that. I say, and that comes in part because the Congress has given away all of its war power. And the judicial branch, they just walk away from this particular issue. If Congress doesn't step up to the plate, the judges aren't going to bail them out. They haven't. And the American people, if they're complacent, Congress isn't going to do anything either. Again, they understand this and they're complacent with it. They don't worry that a president can kill anybody they want. They figure, he's not going to kill me tomorrow, so as long as it's somebody else who's the victim, I won't care about it.
You've called this, quote, the very definition of tyranny. The combined roles of prosecutor, judge, jury, and executioner in secret inside the White House.
Yeah, absolutely. Inside the White House. And I say, we can't, in fairness to Mr. This isn't just his invention. It's been there for close to 20 years. Truly frightening. You may recall those conversations that were revealed in the Obama administration, or Harold Koh, the legal advisor to Hillary Clinton, said, John Brennan's a good guy. He was then CIA director, so I trust him. He's kind. He'll only kill the bad people, But we don't trust anybody to decide life and death by themselves. We have a process called due process of law. But on the other hand, say you got to draw the line someplace. And in isolation, maybe the argument that others that it would work. But Trump is across the board. This is hardly the only constitutional infraction that is day-to-day news in the Trump White House.
What is the exact phraseology on due process of law in the Fifth Amendment?
Yeah. No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And you were depriving somebody of life without due process when you kill them without a trial. Sometimes, for example, in the case of Mr. al-Awlaki in Yemen, he hadn't even been charged with a crime. Maybe he was, but he wasn't indicted by a grand jury or anything. At least Osama bin Laden, you did have a grand jury indicted, but al-Awlaki, nothing. Certainly his teenage son had been charged with anything either. Vaporized, there's no accountability whatsoever.
Well, some of the so-called detainees, they should be called prisoners in Guantanamo, have been there for almost 15 years and haven't been charged. Do they have protection of the Constitution as foreigners? And is there a violation of one of the amendments to our Constitution for such a delay?
Well, first of all, we need to remember that the due process clause protects persons, not just citizens. For example, if you have somebody visiting the United States from anywhere, it could be China, Finland, Hungary, you can't kill them and say, well, you're a foreigner. Due process doesn't apply. If you killed them, you'd be charged with murder. No, they're coming here. They're not attacking you, so you're not acting in self-defense. In Guantanamo Bay, we're not detaining American citizens there, but those detainees are not charged with any crimes. They're just told, well, you're an enemy combatant. Well, what does that mean? Well, you're kind of sympathetic to people we think who are terrorists. And we really don't know what kind of sympathetic means. Did you sew the trousers of Osama bin Laden, or did you act as a chef or something like that? And it shows how much of a show trial the handful of military commission prosecutions are, Ralph, because the fact is, even if they're acquitted of charges of war crimes, and some of them have been accused, they still end up at Guantanamo forever anyway, because it's a status offense. They're never going to be released until a president stands up and says, okay, the war on terrorism is over. You know when that's going to be? Never. No president's ever going to say the incidence of possible terrorism is zero. So even if they're acquitted, they just have to stay in Guantanamo for life until they die.
That territory in Guantanamo in Cuba, is that legally controlled and owned by the U.S.?
Yeah, we have a permanent lease. This is something most don't recognize. After we invaded Cuba during the Spanish-American War, we really dictated writing their constitution. And it provided in the Constitution that they had to lease, a naval base to the United States, which they did. I don't know whether they say it voluntarily. So we have a lease. We exercise all the attributes of sovereignty on Guantanamo Bay. We are every bit as much in Cuban sovereign territory as Russia is in Ukraine by occupying Crimea or otherwise. But we just blind our eyes to that, our double standards.
By the way, when I interviewed Castro, I mentioned Guantanamo, and he said every year he gets a check from the U.S. government for the rental of Guantanamo, and he throws it in a desk drawer, and he never cashes it because he doesn't recognize U.S. sovereignty on that area in Guantanamo Bay.
Yeah. One of the reasons why Guantanamo Bay was chosen to detain these suspected terrorists was because it was thought, since we just have a leasehold interest, we'll claim it's outside U.S. jurisdiction and our provisions for habeas corpus and due process don't apply. Well, if you have a piece of Cuban territory that Fidel Castro can't enter without our permission, that's the definition of sovereignty. And the U.S. Supreme Court finally, 8 years after the opening of Guantanamo, did say that there were rights of habeas corpus to detainees on Guantanamo Bay. But they haven't revisited it, and the lower courts have basically ignored it, and nobody gets released because everyone's fearful of, if I'm a judge and tell somebody that you haven't got proof of being an enemy combatant and something bad happens, I'll look like I'm terrible, and why don't I just keep them detained forever?
I've interviewed military lawyers, the Department of Defense, who were working on Guantanamo Bay cases, and they said that at least 80% of all the prisoners in Guantanamo were innocent from the get-go. They were just picked up by bounty hunters after 9/11 in Afghanistan and delivered to the U.S. military.
When you gave the amount of money that we were offering, they could retire on the Costa del Sol off of France for life. So of course, they're going to go ahead and make up any reason to get revenge against an enemy or something. They get richly rewarded. And the other element that came into play, Ralph, because my view is that 9/11 was mass murder. And that's how we initially prosecuted the so-called 20th hijacker, Zacarias Moussaoui. He was charged with 3,000 counts of murder, not war crimes or anything like that. And he's got a life term. But in order to make 9/11 look more like a war, we had to create something that looked like a detention camp for prisoners. You had to have the props there. So it's like, well, we got to find some enemy combatants, because otherwise our case proclaiming we're at war and exercising all the war powers will not be convincing. And that's why they ended up with, as you pointing out, the vast majority of them never creating any danger whatsoever. They were there just as a Cecil D. DeVille, extra in a cinematic extravaganza. Say, oh wow, hundreds of detainees, the worst of the worst. The fact is that there have been literally hundreds of terrorism cases prosecuted in federal courts since 9/11. Virtually none in the military commissions, which are tied up in knots because they have so many legal problems. And the sentences in the civilian courts have been harsher than in the military commissions. So the whole argument of necessity has been totally discredited by experience over the last 20 years.
And that is count 12 in the impeachment of Donald Trump, violation of the Due Process Clause. Join us again for count 13, violation of the Fourth Amendment.